Most people think a trap is about control. But the truth is, the moment it works too perfectly, something is already wrong. And Ethan Cole knew that the second his field snapped into place and the air shifted like the planet itself had paused to watch. Because nothing about the woman standing inside his capture grid made sense. Not the way she stood exactly in the center, as if she had measured it herself. Not the way her breathing stayed slow, and even while the containment field pulsed at full strength. Not even the way her eyes settled on him the instant he stepped into view. Calm, focused, almost curious, like he was the anomaly instead of her. And Ethan had spent years reading people under pressure. Pirates, smugglers, desperate colonists. And they all shared one thing when the net closed. They reacted. They calculated. They tried something. Anything. But this woman did none of that. She simply watched him. And that was worse. Because silence in moments like this was never empty. It was full of something waiting to happen. He adjusted the control band on his wrist, bringing up the diagnostic overlay. Energy output stable. Containment integrity at 98%. More than enough to hold anything with a pulse. And yet the system lagged for a fraction of a second when it tried to classify her. A tiny stutter that shouldn't exist in equipment he had personally tuned down to the millisecond. Great, he muttered under his breath. Either I finally caught something important, or I broke my own gear. The field shimmered faintly, casting soft blue light across her face, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But instead her gaze moved, not around the trap, not searching for weakness, but across the structure itself like she was reading it, understanding it layer by layer. And that was when Ethan felt the first real shift, subtle but undeniable. The kind that didn't come from movement, but from awareness, like stepping into a room and realizing. Everyone already knows something you don't. He took a slow breath and stepped closer, boots quiet against the metallic ground, keeping his posture loose, controlled, the way you do when you don't want to escalate a situation but also don't want to look unsure. You picked the wrong sector, he said, voice steady, conversational, the way you talk to someone who might become a problem if you push too hard. This grid covers 3 miles in every direction. Nothing gets through it. Her eyes flicked to his wristband, then back to his face. And for the first time, something changed. Not fear, not even resistance, just a slight narrowing. Like she had found the part of the equation she was looking for. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but precise, carrying a clarity that didn't belong in a situation like this. You designed this yourself, she said, not a question, not even impressed, just certain, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not because she was right, but because of how easily she had seen it. Most people needed schematics, data, time. She needed one look. He let out a small breath, half a laugh, half a warning to himself. Yeah, he said. Took a while to get it right. And for a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgment. And somewhere behind him, far beyond the edge of the field, something in the environment shifted, a distant hum changing pitch, as if systems he couldn't see had just started paying attention. And Ethan realized, with a clarity that settled in his bones, that catching her might have been the easiest part of whatever was about to happen next. The hum did not stop. It shifted, like a machine reconsidering its purpose, and Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard anything else. A low resonance threading through the ground and up into the control band on his wrist, subtle enough that most people would miss it. But he had built this system piece by piece, and it had never done that before. Not once. He glanced down, expecting a warning, a fluctuation, anything that made sense. But the display remained calm, almost too calm. Every line of data reporting stability with a confidence that now felt suspicious. Okay, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. That is new. When he looked back up, she had not moved, not a single inch, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It felt deliberate, like a decision being held in place. Her gaze shifted slightly past him, just for a moment, and Ethan followed the movement instinctively, scanning the empty stretch of terrain beyond the trap. At first there was nothing, just the flat metallic expanse stretching for miles under a dim sky. Then the air itself seemed to distort, not visibly at first, more like a pressure change, a presence pressing against the edges of perception, and then the sensors caught up. His wristband flickered, then recalibrated, then tried again, multiple unidentified signatures appearing at the very edge of detection range. Not approaching, not retreating, just there, waiting. Ethan felt a slow tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pattern recognition. This was not random. This was not a coincidence. He shifted his stance slightly, angling his body without making it obvious, keeping the trap between himself and whatever was now out there. "You have friends," he said, tone still light, still controlled, the kind of calm that takes effort. Her eyes returned to him, and for a fraction of a second, something almost like approval flickered across her expression. Not warmth, not kindness, just acknowledgment. "I have many things," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that made the word friends feel like a simplification. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay on the mechanics, the facts, the parts he could control. The trap was active, the field was stable, the perimeter was secure. Everything he had built was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And yet none of that felt relevant anymore, because the situation had already moved beyond the design parameters. He tapped the control band again, pulling up deeper diagnostics, pushing the system harder than he normally would. Layers of code unfolding across the display, response times, energy, distribution, structural integrity, all within expected ranges, until one line flickered, just once, then corrected itself so quickly it might have been nothing. Except Ethan had spent too long staring at systems to ignore something like that. "Do not do that," she said suddenly, and he froze, not because of the words, but because of the timing. She had spoken at the exact moment his finger hovered over the override sequence, a function buried 3 layers deep that no one should have known about unless they had access to his personal build logs. He looked up slowly, meeting her gaze, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity in what he saw there. She was not guessing, she was not observing, she knew. And that shifted something fundamental in the space between them, the kind of shift that does not make noise but changes everything. "That would be inefficient," she added, voice calm, almost conversational, like she was commenting on a minor inconvenience rather than the fact that she had just anticipated his next move with impossible accuracy. Ethan let his hand fall away from the control band, not because he trusted her, but because he suddenly was not sure the system would respond the way he expected if he pushed it. And somewhere beyond the edge of the field, the distant shapes in the air became clearer, outlines forming, not advancing, not threatening, just present, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. And for the first time since the trap had activated, Ethan considered the possibility that whatever was happening here had started long before he arrived, and he had simply stepped into it at exactly the moment he was meant to. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like a held breath that refused to release, and Ethan realized that whatever decision he made next would not just be a reaction. It would be a test, not of his system, but of him. He shifted his weight slightly, keeping his movements slow, deliberate, the way you do when you suspect the situation is no longer governed by the rules you understand. "You seem very confident for someone standing in a containment field," he said, tone even, measured, and for the first time, she moved, not an attempt to escape, not even a step, just a subtle adjustment of posture, a fraction of an inch, but the field responded, not visibly, not dramatically, but the faint hum dipped, then rose again, like it had noticed her and was unsure how to behave. Ethan caught that. Of course he did, because it was his system, and it was not supposed to notice anything. It was supposed to enforce, to contain, to remain indifferent. "Confidence is inefficient when it is unnecessary," she replied, and there was something in the phrasing that made it clear she was not speaking casually. She was describing a principle, one she understood at a level that made Ethan's carefully engineered trap feel suddenly small. He glanced down again, pulling up another layer of diagnostics, pushing past the interface into raw system feedback, the kind of data most operators never saw, lines of code, response loops, adaptive protocols. And there it was again, not a failure, not even an error, but a hesitation, a microscopic delay in how the field adjusted around her position, as if it was recalculating something it had never needed to calculate before. "That is not possible," he muttered, more to himself than to her, and she tilted her head slightly, the motion precise, almost thoughtful. "You built it to respond," she said, and Ethan looked up sharply, because that was exactly what he had done. He had designed the field to adapt, to learn, to anticipate movement patterns and adjust containment accordingly. It was what made it effective, what made it better than anything else in this sector. And now that same feature felt like a vulnerability, because it was not just adapting to her movements, it was adapting to her presence. Everything responds, she continued softly, her gaze steady on him. The question is what it chooses to respond to. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a controlled release that felt more like a recalibration than a breath. He had built systems, negotiated contracts, survived environments that did not care if he existed or not. But this was different. This was a situation where the variables were not just unknown, they were aware. And somewhere beyond the edge of the field, the shapes he had detected earlier became clearer, not approaching, not retreating, but aligning, forming a loose perimeter that mirrored the boundaries of his trap. With unsettling precision, he did not need confirmation to understand what that meant. They were not here to break her out. They were here because she was here, and that realization settled heavily in his chest. So let me guess, he said, forcing a thin line of humor into his voice, the kind that keeps things from tipping too far into something worse. You walked into this on purpose. She did not answer immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any immediate response could have. Her eyes held his, unblinking, measuring, as if deciding how much to reveal, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she inclined her head, not quite agreement, not quite acknowledgment, but close enough that Ethan felt the shift land with quiet certainty. You required a demonstration, she said at last, and the words settled into the space between them like a piece of a larger structure he could not yet see. Of what? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not make things simpler. Her gaze did not waver, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, precise, and entirely without doubt. Of you, she said, and somewhere deep within the system wrapped around her, the containment field flickered, not collapsing, not failing, but reconsidering, as if the trap itself had just been introduced to a new definition of what it was holding. The words settled in the air with a weight that did not belong to sound alone, and Ethan felt something inside his carefully structured understanding begin to shift, not break, not collapse, but loosen, like a mechanism realizing it had been built around the wrong assumption. Of me, he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as a way to hear it again and test whether it made more sense the second time. It did not. And yet the system around her reacted as if it did. The containment field gave a subtle ripple, not outward, but inward, like it was recalibrating its definition of what it was holding. Ethan noticed immediately. Of course he did, because he had designed every layer of it, and none of those layers included uncertainty as a valid state. You are not making sense, he said, though his tone lacked conviction, because something deeper than logic was telling him she was not the one failing to align with reality. He was. She watched him in silence for a moment, and in that silence there was no pressure, no urgency, just patience, the kind that comes from knowing time is not a limiting factor, and that unsettled him more than anything else so far. You built a system that identifies anomalies, she said finally, her voice steady, almost instructional, as if she were explaining a concept rather than revealing something, and you trusted it to recognize what does not belong. Ethan frowned slightly, because that was accurate, uncomfortably accurate. That is the point, he replied, and she inclined her head just enough to acknowledge it. Then why, she asked softly, did it hesitate when it saw me? The question landed with quiet precision, not accusing, not aggressive, just undeniable. Ethan did not answer immediately, because he had already seen the hesitation, the flicker, the moment where the system paused instead of deciding, and he had dismissed it as a glitch, a minor inconsistency, something to review later. But now, with her watching him like this, it felt less like a glitch and more like a signal he had chosen to ignore. He looked down at his control band again, pulling the data back up, replaying the moment frame by frame, slowing it down to the microsecond level, and there it was, clearer now. The system did not fail to classify her. It attempted to, then stopped, then attempted again, as if the classification itself had been rejected. It is not hesitation, she said, as if following his thoughts without effort. It is refusal. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly to meet hers, and for the first time, The possibility formed fully in his mind, not as a passing thought, but as a complete structure. What if the system was not malfunctioning? What if it was encountering something it had been designed to defer to, something outside its authority, something it was not allowed to override? And that idea, simple as it was, carried implications that reached far beyond the trap, beyond the field, beyond anything he had prepared for. That is not possible, he said again, but this time. It sounded less like a statement and more like a defense. She did not contradict him. She did not need to. Instead, she shifted her attention slightly, not away from him, but outward, toward the perimeter, and Ethan followed her gaze without thinking. The distant figures had moved closer now, not rushing, not advancing in any threatening way, just closing the distance with a quiet precision that made their presence feel inevitable. And as they came into clearer view, Ethan noticed something that tightened the last remaining thread of certainty he had been holding on to. They were not looking at him, not even at the trap. Their attention was fixed entirely on her. And more than that, their posture had changed, subtle, but unmistakable, controlled, disciplined, deferential, like professionals waiting for a command that had not yet been given. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt like the end of something rather than the continuation of control. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the earlier confidence, but sharper in a different way. "You are not the one inside the trap," he said. And this time, when she looked at him, there was no need for confirmation, because the answer was already there, waiting for him to accept it. For a long moment, nothing moved, not the distant figures, not the air, not even the faint shimmer of the containment field. And Ethan understood with a clarity that felt almost mechanical that the situation had already crossed a line he could not step back from, because the system he trusted had made a decision without him, and it had not chosen his side. He straightened slightly, not out of confidence, but because standing any other way suddenly felt incorrect, like posture itself had rules he had not been told about. "Then what exactly is this?" he asked, gesturing lightly toward the field, the perimeter. The silent watchers now clearly visible less than 100 yards away, their forms distinct, their presence controlled, each one positioned with a precision that mirrored military discipline, but without any of the tension he would expect from an active operation. They were not preparing. They were waiting, and not for him. She followed his gesture briefly, then returned her gaze to him, as if the answer did not require observation. "A demonstration," she said again. But this time the word carried more structure, more intent, as if it had layers he was only beginning to understand. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay aligned with something resembling logic. Demonstrations had purposes. They proved something. They validated a hypothesis. They revealed a variable. "You said that already," he replied, tone even, though the edges were tightening. "What are you demonstrating?" She studied him for a moment, not evaluating in the way most people did, not looking for weakness or hesitation, but something else, something closer to alignment, as if she was checking whether he had reached the point she expected. "That you notice what others ignore," she said. And Ethan felt the words land with a weight that did not belong to flattery or judgment, just fact, and that unsettled him more than anything else she had said so far, because it meant this was not random, it was not chance, it was targeted. He glanced again at the field, at the faint distortions that now seemed less like containment and more like a boundary he was being allowed to perceive, and the realization formed fully, not as a theory, but as a conclusion. The trap had not just captured her, it had revealed him. "You could have walked through this," he said quietly, and she did not deny it, did not confirm it. She simply held his gaze, which was answer enough. "But you did not," he continued, and this time there was no attempt to mask the shift in his tone, because the implications were no longer abstract. "You stayed." She inclined her head slightly, the movement precise, deliberate, "because leaving would have ended the test," she said, and Ethan let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, because that word, test, changed everything. Tests had criteria, they had outcomes. They had consequences, and he had not agreed to any of this. "You are testing me," he said. And for the first time, the statement did not feel uncertain. It felt correct. She stepped forward then, just one measured step, and the field reacted, not with resistance, not with force, but with a visible hesitation, the light dimming, the hum lowering, as if the system itself was reconsidering whether it had the authority to hold her at all. Ethan watched it happen in real time, his own creation yielding in a way he had never designed it to, and that confirmed what he had already begun to accept. This was not about containment anymore. It was about permission. "You built something that adapts," she said softly, now standing closer to the edge of the field than before. "But you never asked what it should do when it encounters something it is not meant to contain." Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was no easy answer to that. Only the quiet understanding that he had built a system to recognize threats, not authority. And somewhere behind him, the distant figures shifted again, not advancing, not retreating, but adjusting, their formation tightening in a way that felt less like preparation and more like acknowledgment. And when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was steady, but stripped of everything unnecessary. "So what happens when the test is over?" he asked, and this time, when she looked at him, there was no distance left in her gaze, only certainty. "Then," she said, "you decide whether you remain where you are." And the way she said it made it clear that staying might not be an option at all. The air between them felt different now, not tense, not hostile, but weighted, like a decision had already been made somewhere beyond his reach, and he was only just catching up to it. And Ethan realized that for the first time since the trap activated, he was no longer thinking about how to control the situation. He was thinking about what the situation actually was. He shifted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, because sudden movement felt irrelevant here, like reacting to quickly would only prove he was still playing by the wrong rules. "You said I decide," he said, voice steady but quieter now, stripped down to something more precise. "That suggests I have a choice." She watched him closely, and there was a subtle change in her expression, not softer, not warmer, but more focused, as if this was the part that mattered. "You always had one," she replied, and the way she said it made it clear that the choice had been present long before he noticed it. Ethan let that settle, turning it over in his mind, because choices implied alternatives, and alternatives implied consequences, and nothing about this felt optional anymore. He glanced briefly at the field again, at the faint shimmer that now seemed less like a barrier and more like a line he had already crossed without realizing it. "Then explain something to me," he said. "If this is a test, and I am the one being evaluated, why use something like this?" He gestured again, not just to the trap, but to the entire setup, the perimeter, the watchers, the quiet coordination of it all. "You could have just asked." For a moment, there was something almost like amusement in her eyes, not mockery, not dismissal, just a recognition of the simplicity of his perspective. "You would have answered differently," she said, and Ethan did not respond right away, because he knew that was true. If she had approached him without context, without pressure, without forcing him into a situation where his instincts took over, he would have given her something measured, controlled, incomplete, the kind of answer people give when they do not yet understand the stakes. "So this," he said slowly, "this forces a real response." She inclined her head slightly, confirming without needing to say the word, and Ethan exhaled, a small, quiet sound that carried more acceptance than frustration, because the logic, however unsettling, was consistent. He had built systems that did the same thing, removed variables, forced clarity, exposed what was real under pressure, and now he was on the other side of that equation. "And what exactly did you see?" he asked, not defensive, not challenging, just direct. She stepped forward again, another measured movement, and the field responded more visibly this time, the light dimming further, the hum dropping to a low resonance that felt less like resistance and more like permission being reconsidered. She was close enough now that the boundary between them felt conceptual rather than physical, and when she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that left no room for interpretation. "You did not trust the outcome," she said. "So you questioned it." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because that was exactly what he had done. From the moment the trap activated, he had not accepted it at face value. He had looked for flaws, inconsistencies, anything that did not fit. Most would not, she continued. Most would accept success without examining it. And there was something in the way she said most that made it clear he was not being compared to an ideal, but to a standard he had already exceeded. Ethan glanced once more at the figures beyond the field, now standing in a clear formation, their posture unchanged, their attention unwavering. And for the first time, he understood their role completely. They were not there to intervene. They were there to witness, to confirm, to observe the result of something that had already been decided. And when he looked back at her, his voice carried a different weight, less guarded, more certain. "So this was never about catching you," he said, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer made everything else fall into place. The trap, the hesitation, the system's refusal, the presence of those watching. All of it aligned into a single structure that he could finally see clearly. And for a moment, the silence returned. But this time it was not uncertain. It was complete, like the last piece of a pattern settling into place. And Ethan realized that whatever came next was not going to be determined by the system he built, but by whether he was willing to step beyond it. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, quiet and precise, until Ethan could no longer pretend he was still standing inside the same situation he had designed, because the rules had shifted, and more importantly, he had recognized that they had never been his to define in the first place. He looked at the containment field again, not as a tool, but as something that had revealed its limits. The faint blue light now dimmed to a soft outline, the hum barely audible, like it was waiting rather than enforcing. And for the first time since it activated, Ethan did not reach for the controls. He simply observed it, the way she had observed him, and that shift in perspective felt more significant than anything he had done so far. "So this is the part where I fail or pass," he said, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgment of the structure he now understood. She remained still, her gaze steady, but there was a subtle change in her posture, not relaxation, not tension, something closer to attention, as if the next moment mattered in a way the previous ones had not. "This is the part where you decide," she corrected softly, and the distinction mattered more than the words themselves, because failure and success implied external judgment, but decision implied ownership. And Ethan felt that difference settle into place with a clarity that left little room for hesitation. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, not because he was calm, but because he was choosing to be. And that was new. That was different, because before this, every action he had taken was a response to a system, to a threat, to a situation that demanded it. But now, there was no demand, only the absence of resistance, and that was far more difficult to navigate. "You said I could remain where I am," he said, his voice quieter now, not weaker, just more focused. "That sounds like staying is an option." She did not answer immediately, and in that silence, Ethan realized something else. She was not guiding him. She was not leading him toward a specific outcome. She was allowing him to reach it on his own, and that meant whatever came next would not be corrected, would not be adjusted. It would stand as it was. "It is an option," she said at last, and her tone carried no weight of preference, no indication of what she expected. And that absence of direction was the final piece he needed, because it meant this was not about proving something to her anymore. It was about aligning with something he had already begun to understand. Ethan glanced once more at the distant figures, now fully visible. Their presence unmistakable, their posture unchanged. Not a single one of them had moved to intervene. Not a single one had questioned what was happening. And that told him everything he needed to know about her position in whatever structure they belonged to. They were not waiting for instructions. They were waiting for confirmation. And that confirmation was not coming from her. It was coming from him. He looked back at her, meeting her gaze without hesitation this time. And there was no uncertainty left in the space between them. Only a quiet, undeniable understanding. "If I stay," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then I go back to thinking this was control." He paused briefly, not because he doubted the thought, but because he was acknowledging it fully before moving past it. But it was never control. Her eyes held his, and there was something there now, not approval, not satisfaction, something deeper, something that felt like recognition, and Ethan felt the last of his resistance settle, not disappear, but align. "So if I decide," he continued, his voice steady, grounded in something that no longer needed validation, "then I am not staying." The words did not echo, they did not shift the environment, but something else did. Something less visible, but far more significant. The field between them dimmed further, the boundary losing its definition, not collapsing, not breaking, simply no longer necessary. And for the first time since the trap had activated, Ethan took a step forward, not cautiously, not testing, just a single, deliberate movement across the line he had created, and nothing stopped him. Nothing resisted. The system did not react. The watchers did not move, and she did not step back. She simply observed, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. And when Ethan came to a stop just inside the space that had once been defined as containment, he understood that the test had never been about whether he could hold something, but whether he could recognize when to let go of the need to hold it at all. The moment he stepped across the boundary, the world did not react the way it should have. There was no surge of energy, no alarm, no correction from the system that had been designed to prevent exactly that kind of movement. Instead, there was only a quiet absence, like something had been acknowledged and then dismissed as no longer relevant, and Ethan felt it immediately, not physically, but in the way the space around him shifted from resistance to allowance, as if the environment itself had recalculated his position and decided he belonged somewhere else now. He stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough to see the fine details he had not noticed before, the subtle precision in the way she held herself, the controlled stillness that was not rigid but intentional. Like every movement she did not make was as deliberate as the one she did, and for the first time since this began, he realized he was no longer observing her as a target, or even as an anomaly, but as a point of reference, something stable in a situation that had stripped everything else of certainty. Behind him, the faint outline of the containment field dissolved further, not collapsing, just fading into the background like a thought that had finished its purpose, and beyond it, the figures that had been watching adjusted again, their formation tightening by a fraction, not in response to threat, but in recognition of completion. Ethan did not need to turn around to know that. He could feel it in the way the air settled, in the way the distant hum of systems realigned into something quieter, more ordered. So that was it, he said, his voice steady, but carrying a trace of something new, not confusion, not doubt, something closer to clarity. The moment I stopped treating this like a trap, she watched him without interruption, and there was a subtle shift in her gaze, not softer, not warmer, but deeper, as if the distance between observation and understanding had closed. You stopped reacting to the structure, she said, and the way she phrased it made it clear that the structure had never been the point. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to her, because that was exactly what had changed. He had stopped looking for the rules and started recognizing the absence of them. And that had been the real boundary all along, not the field, not the system, but his own assumption that there had to be something controlling the outcome. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes after something aligns internally rather than resolves externally. And that is what you were waiting for, he said, and this time it was not a question. She inclined her head just enough to confirm, and for a brief moment, the silence returned again. But now it felt complete, not uncertain, not heavy, just finished, like the end of a sequence that had been building toward a single point. Ethan glanced past her then, not out of distraction, but because something in the environment had shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible. The figures in the distance were no longer just watching. They had adjusted their posture in unison, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but enough that the change was undeniable. Their stance had moved from observation to acknowledgment, and that told him more than any explanation could have. Whatever she was to them, whatever role she held, it was not minor, it was not optional, and more importantly, it was not questioned. He looked back at her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to ask the question that had been forming since the beginning, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Who are you? The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had happened. Every shift, every realization, every piece of structure that had fallen. A way to reveal something much larger underneath. She did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Ethan understood that the answer was not just information. It was context, something that would redefine everything he thought he understood about the last few minutes. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, precise, and entirely certain, not revealing, but confirming what had already been implied. I am the reason they are here, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more authority than any title could have, because it explained everything without needing to name it. And behind her, as if in silent agreement, the distant figures lowered their heads just slightly, not in submission, not in display, but in recognition, and Ethan felt the final piece settle into place, not as a shock, but as a quiet, undeniable truth. He had not captured something important, he had stepped into something that had already decided he was. The acknowledgment from the figures behind her did not echo, did not ripple outward. It simply settled into the moment like a fact that had always been true, and Ethan felt the weight of it not as pressure, but as alignment, as if everything that had happened since the trap activated had been building toward this single realization, that he was no longer dealing with a situation he could define, but with something that had already defined him. He studied her again, not searching for weakness, not trying to categorize, but observing the way everything around her seemed to respond without instruction. The air, the silence, even the absence of movement carried a kind of order that did not need to be enforced, and that was what made it different, not power, but certainty. "You said I decide," he said slowly, the words deliberate, not questioning anymore. "So this is the part where I ask what that decision actually means." She did not look away, and for the first time there was something in her expression that shifted beyond observation, not softer, not more human, but more direct, like the distance between them had finally been reduced to its simplest form. "It means you choose whether to remain defined by what you built," she said, and Ethan felt that land with a clarity that did not leave room for interpretation, because he knew exactly what she meant: the systems, the structures, the need to understand everything before acting. All of it had kept him effective, safe, predictable, and now, standing here, those same things felt like limits rather than tools. He exhaled slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because he was recognizing something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that stepping beyond those limits was not about abandoning control. It was about choosing where it applied. He glanced briefly at the fading outline of the containment field, now little more than a memory of light against the ground, and realized that it no longer represented success or failure. It represented a version of himself that had already done what it needed to do. "And if I do not remain," he said, his voice steady, grounded, "then what?" She stepped closer, closing the last of the distance between them without hesitation, and nothing in the environment resisted, nothing corrected, the space simply allowed it. And that in itself was the answer to a question he had not fully asked yet. "Then you step into something that does not need to contain you to understand you," she said, and the words carried a weight that extended far beyond the moment, beyond the field, beyond the silent figures who had now lowered their heads slightly further, not in submission, but in confirmation. Ethan held her gaze, and for a brief moment, the world narrowed to a single point of clarity, not forced, not constructed, just present, and in that moment, he understood something that had been building since the beginning. That this was never about proving he was capable. It was about recognizing that capability had already been seen, already been measured, and already been chosen. "You already decided," he said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just acknowledging the structure he now understood completely. She did not deny it. She did not soften it. She simply met his gaze with the same certainty she had carried from the start. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of the answer made everything else fall away, leaving only what mattered. And for a moment, Ethan considered the alternative, the idea of stepping back, of returning to the systems he knew, the patterns he trusted, the life that had always made sense because it stayed within defined boundaries. And then he looked at the space around him, at the absence of resistance, at the presence of something that did not need to prove itself to exist. And he made the only decision that still aligned with what he had already become in this moment. He did not step back. He did not hesitate. He simply nodded once, a small, deliberate movement that carried more weight than any declaration. And that was enough. The environment shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely. The last trace of the field faded into nothing. The distant figures straightened in perfect unison, their posture no longer observational but resolved, and she watched him with that same steady gaze, now no longer evaluating, but recognizing. "Then you come with me," she said, not as a command, not as a request, but as the next step in something that had already begun. And as Ethan stood there, no longer inside a trap, no longer outside it, he realized that the only thing that had ever been captured in this entire sequence was the version of himself that believed he needed one.